Shantae, Half-Genie Hero marks a significant moment for the series, being the first game that wasn't developed primarily for a handheld system. All three prior titles were created with the portable market in mind, and the considerations that would have been at the forefront of the developers' minds in regards to how a handheld game should look and play are reflected in their designs. Pirate's Curse traipsed towards this shift, with the Wii U version releasing just 2 months after the game had launched on 3DS, denoting that work on both versions was occurring coincidentally. Half-Genie Hero, though, took one stride forward on this front, appearing on 5 platforms at the same time upon its debut, with the only handheld system out of those being the Vita. In the 4th episode of this series, I will be looking at how Half-Genie Hero has evolved from the previous games, as well as if the transition to home console had any impact on its design tendencies. All footage of the game you'll see in this video was taken from the PC version, although for the first time there appears to be a complete uniformity across all the systems it has appeared on thus far. I've mentioned in previous videos how WayForward creates licensed games as means to put bread on the table, and that original titles like Shantae are not indicative of the general output from them. One reason for the series making handhelds its domain has been the lower cost of development, in addition to factors such as 2D platformers being better suited to that market, and the greater experience the developers have accrued over time for these systems. While creating Pirate's Curse, WayForward felt that they were reaching the limit of what a Shantae game could be at that time. This wasn't due to them having exhausted their resources of creative thinking, but rather the budget they could scrape together for a Shantae game would be insufficient in allowing them to take the next step with the series. Matt Bozon stated in an interview with Nintendo Life that they're only able to put about 5% of their savings into creating original works. He also explained that Mighty Switch Force 2 was forged on the back of 8 different licensed games, so to create a high-definition multi-console Shantae experience would take years of squirreling away the money from all their other odd jobs. So in 2013, they made a pilgrimage to the hot new destination for all small-scale game developers who were looking to bring their project to life, but didn't have the means to do so. Kickstarter. I don't think there's any need for me to explain how the Kickstarter model works, and I'm sure everyone watching is aware of both the successes and horror stories that have emerged from crowdfunding campaigns, as this new means of financing has grown exponentially over the past decade. As far as Kickstarters go, Half-Genie Heroes was about as honest and safe a campaign as you'll find. With WayForward having been in business for 23 years by this point, and with a myriad of works to their name, fans didn't suffer from any reluctance when it came to parting with their cash to help fund Shantae's 4th adventure. The campaign was very transparent, with explaining why they had turned to Kickstarter to create a game for an already well-entrenched franchise. They openly explained that approval to release a new Shantae game on all major platforms had been granted, but their usual self-publishing budget wouldn't cut it, which was the impetus for them to launch this crowdfunding effort. A target was set at $400,000, which not only would be met, but by the end of their funding, more than double this amount had been raised. Most of this surplus bankrolling allowed for the development of DLC content, with those who backed the game receiving these extras free of charge. As the title of the game implies, Half-Genie Hero sees the return of Shantae's signature transformative ability, allowing her to take on various animal forms, which provides a slew of skills that are required in order to traverse the landscape. Stalwart creatures such as the monkey and elephant return once again as staples of the series, along with an abundance of new forms that make their debut. The bat allows Shantae to hover in place and fly strictly along the x-axis. The crab finally makes its debut after being part of the ill-fated Shantae GBA game, and works in much the same way that the demo for that unreleased title showed, with the ability to drift in waters. The most interesting new addition though would be the mouse, by far the tiniest being to be featured yet. When playing as this diminutive rodent, you can fit into exceedingly small gaps that will lead to otherwise inaccessible locations. Half-Genie's bounteousness with its transformational options allows for greater choice on the player's part with how to tackle various obstacles, and also enables the implementation of new challenges that weren't possible with the previous games. While certain scenarios dictate a specific means to overcome them, you're provided with greater variety and freedom to experiment with how you wish to surmount obstructions, both organic and artificial, letting you decide to make use of whichever method works best for you. Complementing this expanded roster is what is easily by far the best transformation system yet. Upon entering dance mode, you can freely select whichever form you'd like to take. The selection cycles through 3 different menus, each containing 4 possible options, granting access to 12 choices far more efficiently than previous systems allowed. As transforming is an action that's performed frequently, the swiftness of the system preserves the tempo, preventing the action from halting for too long. The order that you acquire these forms has been carefully considered, with the abilities of certain creatures being superseded by those that appear later on. While the crab can drift in water, it is made practically redundant when the mermaid becomes available that can swim more freely. The same goes for the bat, which serves little purpose after the harpy makes its triumphant return, once again trivialising the difficulty of many areas by being able to soar high above any danger. To ensure that these quote-unquote inferior transformations aren't made completely superfluous, certain treasures are only acquirable through specific transmogrifications, such as a narrow corridor of spikes that the harpy is too big to fly through, but the bat can conquer with ease. There is a paucity of moments like these though, and with this being another relatively brisk adventure, many forms aren't given time to flourish. The mouse is the biggest missed opportunity. Exploring areas from a perspective not yet seen in the series should have opened up a whole suite of new platforming challenges and puzzles that could have been radically different from anything we've seen previously. Instead, it's relegated to traversing nooks and crannies with minimal combat and even less grey matter needing to be applied to figure out how to reach the other end. So while a greater range of animals and mythical creatures are presented here, few of them are really explored and taken advantage of by the level design, with most not really progressing beyond their necessitated usage in the most basic of ways. The biggest alteration to the Shantae formula this time around is in how levels are presented. Pirate's Curse moved away from the singular Metroidvania-esque map to the micro-worlds in the form of islands you explored, which functioned in essentially the same way, just on a smaller scale. Half-Genie goes even further with this by having selectable levels that are no more than that. Just levels. Gone are the dungeons, differentiable from other areas by their increased difficulty and greater focus on puzzle solving, replaced by 6 different linear areas to prevail over. This isn't to say that simply running from one end of the level to the other is all you'll be tasked with. Each one contains a number of collectibles and treasures that you'll need to locate in order to complete the various quests you're tasked with over the course of this journey. Like with previous games, many of these trinkets are inaccessible without possessing the requisite transformation, so you'll be dipping in and out of these worlds frequently after your first completion of them for re-exploration. The items you'll find are a mix of those that are plot crucial, to optional upgrades such as extra hearts and transformational augmentations. As with Pirate's Curse, this is quite a contentious move away from the world design of the initial 2 games, and their single persistent world. Whether or not this is the right decision for the series is mostly in the eye of the player, and is very much subjective as to which is better. Both systems have their advantages. The old Metroidvania style allowed for a greater sense of adventure, allowing exploration to feel more natural, and was generally just a more unique presentation for a 2D platformer, especially at the time of the original. This level format, on the other hand, offers a more refined, concise take, maintaining a consistent flow that provides more efficient play without time being spent on backtracking through areas to reach where you want to be. I personally preferred the more leisurely pace of the older games. Half-Genie Hero in particular is a game that moves along at a breakneck clip, which is fine for the action sequences, but it rarely lets up and provides time for the story and characters to breathe. Furthermore, Shantae's capabilities as a character better lend themselves to a more exploratory world. There is greater satisfaction in discovering a secret area in a remote corner of the map that just doesn't transfer over to these more isolated locales. I also think that Sequinland felt more like a living, breathing world when presented in the Metroidvania style, rather than the more disjointed sense I get from it when it comes with selectable levels. Each new area is unlocked in a set order, but you're not completely limited as to when you have to complete certain tasks, and can perform some quests out of sequence. There are a number of occasions when you can gather the items needed to complete an assignment before even being tasked with doing so. This is a mostly inconsequential practice, however, as even if you successfully contend the pre-arranged order, you're not able to complete that quest until it becomes available in the story. Performing semi-intended pseudo-sequence breaks like this is commonly found with utility-based explorative games, and is usually included to reward those who venture off the beaten track to unearth treasures earlier than intended. Sadly, here, the player's curiosity goes without guerdon, the only advantage being to save time later on in locating the necessary items after you're explicitly told to do so. As for the stage design itself, it's on par with previous efforts by the team. So still very good, but for the first time I can't say it's a definitive improvement. The platforming action is slick, and there's some great creativity on display with the location of the hidden items. But this is par for the course with the series by this point. WayForward know full well how to make a game that best showcases their purple-haired mascot's abilities, and always succeed in level design that complements both Shantae's mechanics and whimsical story. Efforts have clearly been made to improve upon the previously instigated ideas. Items for one have reverted to being fuel-based, with this being my preferred system, rather than as limited usage consumables. You can now also toggle whether you want certain items to be on or off. While this feature may not have gotten any usage from myself, I can envision some situations where people may have bought an item only to regret it. Most notable in this regard is the metronome, which accelerates your transformation speed considerably, so much so that some may find it too fast, so although it's non-refundable, you're not forced to make use of it. A late game 2D shooter section also returns, last being used in Risky's Revenge. I'm not sure what WayForward's fascination is with incorporating this genre into their platformers, but it's still not executed particularly well here, even if it has been slightly improved upon, mostly because I like the Gradius style options here. As is tradition at this point, I feel inclined to talk about the warp system, seeing as how this mechanic has been altered in every game so far to account for the change in gameplay style. What we have in Half-Genie Hero is by far the most convenient system to date. First of all, if you're in a level and wish to leave, you can do so at any time, so you're not required to purchase flares or find squids. In addition to this, you can also perform a warp dance, teleporting you to the next area in a stage, providing you've been there previously. This means that when you're on the hunt for hidden items, you don't have to spend time trudging through areas you have no desire of being in, and can simply blink to the zone that houses whatever it is you're looking for. This system is probably the most indicative of the ever-growing trend in quality of life features that people expect when playing games with an exploratory focus. Although I had issues with the warp system in the original Shantae, the fact that game even had the ability to quickly transport yourself across the world wasn't necessarily a given at the time. As the years have passed, game worlds have become gargantuan, especially with the increased popularity of open world adventures, so the need for systems that can allow the player avatar to instantly relocate from one point to another has become a necessity. I think this expectation among players for this feature has trickled down into smaller games like Half-Genie Hero. Even if there was no warp system at all, the reality is that you wouldn't be spending that much longer completing the game, but it still would have been conspicuous in its absence, and probably would have been lambasted for its lack of inclusion. Stage bosses are another field in which WayForward seem to keep flip-flopping on how they should be designed. This time around, bosses are back to not mandating the usage of transformations in order to overcome. A number of them can't even be directly attacked without first making use of some kind of gimmick, such as the exploding barrels in the first boss, or by taking advantage of the cannons against Wilbur. While this style of design does restrict the player in how they go about overcoming these bosses, they also prevent an issue that popped up in previous games with some encounters degenerating into slugfests devoid of strategy, where victory was assured provided you had enough healing supplies. I know I've previously mentioned how I prefer the bosses don't force you to make use of transformations, instead leaving that decision up to the personal preference of the player, but I think that Half-Genie has gone in the wrong direction this time, making your signature skills all but worthless in these situations. Pirate's Curse managed to find the optimal balance so far, with that game forcing pirate tool usage on some occasions, while being more hands-off on others. As I touched on earlier, and you've undoubtedly noticed in the gameplay footage, Half-Genie Hero sports a new appearance with its HD visuals, featuring graphics that provide a more hand-drawn look, rather than the pixel art style seen previously. Inspired by 90s anime heroines, Shantae's presentation now more closely resembles the works that she is built upon. Although anime-style artwork has been present in the past 2 games through character portraits, this is the first time that this has transitioned fully into the in-game graphics, albeit with a more modern art style than the initial sources of inspiration. An increased resolution may have limited material impact on the game itself, and the series has never faltered on the visual front, but this evolution is important in bringing Shantae in line with her contemporaries. Furthermore, as this game was intended to be played on displays many times larger than that of a Game Boy or DS, the vector-based assets used here will scale much better to the varying sizes of monitor that the game will appear on. I may appreciate sprite-based games as much as the next person, but when comparing this to playing Risky's Revenge on PC, it's glaringly apparent how that game was designed for a compact handheld. A different brush may have been used this time, but that doesn't mean it was to cover up weaknesses elsewhere. The animation is still top-notch, with each character having distinctive movements and quirks that help convey their characteristics and differentiate themselves from each other. The change in art style allows for improved fluidity in the animation, as well as for more detailed and varied facial expressions to be seen on sprites, which really helps bring the characters to life that little bit more. And yes, being a Shantae game, this does mean more fluid jiggliness, for want of a better term. Most of the tried and true locations return as the stage settings, and even with the higher level of graphical sheen, are still instantly recognisable. Scuttletown, Mermaid Waterfalls, and the desert of course, all look great in this incarnation, even if they are a bit old hat by this point. Expansions have been made to reinvigorate new life into these areas. Rather than going underground in the desert, you now climb a great tower, leading to ruins that are inexplicably located at a great altitude. Mermaid Falls has seen industrial development in the form of a factory that's used to manufacture counterfeit mermaids, which not only contains some great vertical challenges with the perpetually moving hooks that need to be clung onto, but also the best music track in the game. The only new locales are Cape Crustacean, which starts off with a magical carpet race, an auto-scrolling section where Shantae must leap from one airborne vehicle to the next, and a redesigned Risky's hideout for the final act. While most of the environments are definitely feeling a bit stale by this point, they are at least suitably altered for each game to provide new challenges and secrets, so they never feel repetitive from a gameplay perspective. From a world-building viewpoint, however, I was hoping to see a bit more originality by this point in the series. As Sequinland isn't a world constrained by too many rules, just about any sort of conceivable environment could be incorporated without seeming out of place. I didn't mention the soundtrack in my last video, an omission not out of negligence or forgetfulness, but rather because I didn't have anything to say on the matter. Along with the animation, Shantae's soundtracks have consistently remained at an exceptionally high level. The operative word of this series is evolution, and if an element doesn't evolve across games, but there is also no degradation in its quality, then I see no reason to comment on it, as I would just be repeating myself. Half-Genie's soundtrack isn't better than prior games when it comes to composition or melodies, but it does enjoy some advantages as explained by composer Jake Hoffman in a video on WayForward's YouTube channel. The increased budget and storage size of the platforms the game is on allows for full studio music production with live instruments, and he wasn't forced to synthesize the sounds. He also discusses his enjoyment of the sense of playfulness that permeates through the Shantae series, and how he tries to incorporate this feeling into his music. His words do ring true when playing the game, as there is a greater clarity in the sound than before, and even a vocal track performed by Shantae's voice actor Christina V. Like with the upgraded visuals, this added luster helps make the game stand out, and marks the next evolution from pixel art games with 8-bit inspired soundtracks that were so prevalent just a few years ago. Shantae Half-Genie Hero is undoubtedly another success for the series, an enjoyable, if too brief romp through Sequin Land once again, complete with all the elements that you'd expect from the games by this point. It is the first time that I can't say I decisively enjoyed it more than the previous titles though. Some of this feeling comes down to how the game serves as a soft reboot for the franchise, rather than as a proper continuation of the Shantae saga. Coming out on such a wide array of platforms, and having the highest production values to date, WayForward wanted to make this an entry point in the series for newcomers, and so, as to not confuse or alienate anyone, they hit the proverbial reset switch on the story and characters. Well, when I say hit, it was more like a gentle push. The plot does clearly take place after Pirate's Curse, and moments from that game are referenced, but it feels like a lot of the character development has been undone. Risky herself seemed to be heading on something of a path to redemption, but like a Saturday morning cartoon villain, she's reverted back to her usual life of villainy as if nothing has happened. The same goes for the rest of the cast. One of the more interesting acts in the narrative of Pirate's Curse was in discovering Rotti's soul, and how the interactions with it helped strengthen Rotti's and Shantae's relationship. This move towards developing the side characters has been done away with here, and everyone reverts to mostly playing the role of exposition and hint-spewing automatons. As I mentioned earlier, with how I feel that Sequin Land should be more fleshed out as a world by now, the same can be said for the majority of the troupe. Shantae herself is doing just fine in the development department, her continued growth being adequately documented with each passing instalment, but everyone else appears to be in purgatory. Even in action platformers such as this, where plot and characters are secondary to the gameplay, you still want those elements to be strong enough to actually give said gameplay life and meaning. The meat of the game may just be going from A to B, with some detours to collect various curios, but a strong cast and immersive world can help a game really individualise itself, and the Shantae series is at risk of losing what it has built up so far over the first 3 games if it continues in this direction. What does somewhat offset this issue are the numerous additional game modes available here that either intensify or complement the main story in some way. Downloadable content. It's a thing. Shantae has it now. After the game's release, a number of DLC packs were released for it, a first for the series. This extra content is what provides access to a whole range of new game modes, some of which don't even focus on Shantae. The most compelling of these are Pirate Queen's Quest and Friends to the End. The former of the two allows you to play as Risky and offers a shift in perspective of the central plot. The second focuses on Sky, Bolo and Rotti, and occurs during one of the latter arcs of the game's main story. Both of these give an opportunity for many of the minor characters to briefly take centre stage. By taking Shantae herself away for a while, we get a slightly more in-depth look at these characters, both in the dialogue sequences and through actually getting to play as them. While these scenarios are fairly brief, they do enough to counteract the lack of development and screen time they receive during the main game. It's a shame these couldn't have been more smoothly incorporated into the base game, rather than being side stories, but that likely wasn't feasible for a company the size of WayForward, and would have drastically increased development time. The remaining alternate game modes and stories are non-canon, and focus on providing Shantae with a different skill set than her standard transformations. These are less essential to play, but they do help mitigate one of the other flaws of Half-Genie Hero, which is its lack of difficulty. This might have been the easiest game in the series yet, although it's facing strong competition for revenge for this title. It doesn't take finding many additional hearts before you're a veritable damage sponge who needn't pay attention to most enemies and their attacks. Hardcore mode forces you to be mindful of every foe you encounter, with their superior numbers and surge in power dealing greater damage to you. This assortment of extras adds fantastic replay value to the game, but I think they're best enjoyed sometime after a first playthrough. These modes have you going through the same levels and fighting the same bosses, just with altered mechanics, so the repetitiveness of playing through the same areas probably would be less pronounced the longer you wait. This is just my preference though, and I'm sure many are perfectly happy to start the game anew as soon as the end credits finish. I do get a sense that apart from the improved graphical and audio fidelity, little else was done to take advantage of the improved hardware. Under the hood of the shiny new exterior, there isn't really much that hasn't been done before, or would have been capable of on the handhelds the series previously occupied. Despite some of my criticisms and changes to Half-Genie Hero not progressing the series in what I feel like could be the optimal direction, sales figures for the game would suggest otherwise, and that this is the path to greater success for the franchise. Once again, I don't have solid metrics, but using the new box later method for calculating sales of a game on Steam would suggest around 160,000 purchases on that platform alone. Along with all the console releases and the other PC digital distribution services that the game is available on, this is quite likely the most successful entry so far. While this can be partially attributed to the growing awareness and popularity of the series over time, I think the resurgence in 2D platformers has also aided this prosperity. I talked about the rise of the indie platformer in my last video, but what most of those games I mentioned there had in common was that they were primarily PC games. Oddly enough, despite 2D platformers throughout history having always seen their greatest achievements on consoles, it would be on home computers that the genre would undergo a renaissance. It wouldn't be for a few years for this new interest in the genre to trickle down into consoles, as indicated by the distinct absence of this type of game on PS3 and Xbox 360. Only in the following generation would this new wave of platformers that had emerged through freeware and low-budget games make its way onto home consoles. Sony led the charge here with their revamped submission process for games that would be developed by smaller companies, and their greater promotion of independent works being a surprisingly key part of their PR strategy for the PS4. This allowed for smaller games, of which many were platformers like Shantae, to find a much larger audience on consoles than had been possible in years. The combination of this change in attitudes by big-time players in the games industry and players alike, along with the continued effort put in by WayForward, is what has allowed Shantae to become one of the major success stories of the past decade in the indie gaming scene. In the next episode of this series, we come to what will be the finale for the time being. I hope you'll join me again, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video.